Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Maryland Native Plant Society's webinar, Climate Change, Native Plants, and the Restoration of Biodiversity with Dr. Sara Via of the University of Maryland. My name is Ann DeNovo, and I'll be your host this evening. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Sara Via, is a biologist, professor and climate extension specialist at the University of Maryland College Park. She is a frequent speaker on climate change and its impacts on ecosystems, biodiversity, suburban landscapes, health, and agriculture. Recently, she has been working to develop climate-friendly landscaping strategies that will increase the use of native plants and biodiversity and improve stormwater management while reducing carbon emissions and sequestering carbon. She works with Maryland Master Gardeners and Maryland Master Naturalists to help the members of those programs spread the word about climate change in their outreach programs. She is also the author of a comprehensive report that will be published in 2021, Increasing Soil Health and Sequestering Carbon in Agricultural Soils, a Natural Climate Solution. And with that, Sara, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, terrific. I realize this title is a little different from the one that Anne read. When I sent her the title way back, whenever that was, I was planning on talking just about climate change, but I have recently realized that climate change is just one of our failures of sustainability that are affecting native plants and insects. And so I decided to make this a little broader and talk about several different kinds of human impacts, not just climate change. So with that, and plus I wanted to add insects, since insects and plants are so intertwined with one another. I want to give you a little history about what the plant world looked like in North America before the Europeans colonized. From about 15,000 years ago until European colonization, we had native landscapes starting in the West that ranged from conifer forests to mountain meadows to grasslands where the buffalo were roaming, of course, prairies, and in the eastern, pretty much east of the Mississippi, we had eastern deciduous forests. This is a picture from the Joyce-Kilmer National Forest, which I believe is one of the only old growth stands remaining in the East Coast, and it's really quite an amazing place to go to if you get the chance. So in these native landscapes, there was very high biodiversity of both plants and animals, vertebrates, invertebrates, microbes, and the species interactions, the interactions among the species in the communities, plants to insects, predators to prey, had been tuned over many years by evolution, and things were working well. Everything was working well together. The Native Americans, of course, were on the scene, but they had a very minor impact on ecosystems overall. There was a little burning, but other than that, they had a pretty small footprint. So at that time, ecosystem services were really at peak. They were going really well. Water quality was high. Water was being regulated. That means it was raining and infiltrating into the soil, not running off as it often does now. Nutrient cycling was working, et cetera. Then the European colonists came and they really altered the landscape. Pretty much as soon as they arrived, they started to undergo a massive land conversion from native forests or some prairie out here, but mostly native forests in the east to begin with, to agriculture and then later to development, of course. But if we look at the coverage of the U.S. by old growth forest, in 1620, it was pretty continuous in the east. And then, of course, the Great Plains. And we had some forests along the mountains and the West Coast, of course, the maritime forests. By 1850, we're seeing some land clearing for agriculture. pretty pronounced here in the Midwest with the Scandinavian settlers. By 1920, a picture is totally different. The old growth forest in the east has really been decimated. And then if we look at the picture in 2006, you can see that there's various green here, mixed deciduous and evergreen forests. And this is all second growth. So it's, tends to be a little scrubbier. The trees are smaller and it's kind of filling in where farms were abandoned or around suburban developments, et cetera. So when the Europeans came, they began the extractive economy with their interactions with the land. Agriculture became more and more mechanized and more industrialized as time went on. In the 1940s, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer became available. And after that, pretty much everybody used that. Various agricultural chemicals. Of course, back at the very beginning of the European settlers, the sod busters, they were doing tillage, of course. And now much of the, 42 some million acres of the US is covered with lawn. So that's a very different landscape. Land use is not very sustainable because, again, it's extractive. People are taking from the land and giving very little back. And there's been a loss of native habitats, and biodiversity, as you will discover in the rest of this talk, has really taken a hit from that. So some people will be saying, not you, because I'm sure everyone in this webinar is interested in plants or you wouldn't be here. But many people say, so what? Who cares? I don't go outside. I'm not a hiker. I'm not a tree hugger. What has nature done for me lately? Okay, so people do not think that they are really part of the whole natural world. So-called ecosystem services can be divided up or depicted in this way. It's really, ecosystem services are the set of things that essentially the whole natural world in combination with the physical world of the earth, all the things they do for us. So this little graphic divides those services into 4 parts: supporting services, formation of soil by microbes, and then keeping it healthy, which essentially is the job of microbes and plant roots, biodiversity and habitats, all natural organisms, photosynthesis, which is the basis of all life on Earth. Plants, photosynthesizing plants are the only ones who can make their own food. Everyone else has to eat plants, whether they eat them directly or not. So those are the supporting services. Provisioning services. What provisions do ecosystems provide us? Well, in concert with the geological and physical world, of course, water is provided to all living things. Food, whether you be a human or not, food is provided on land, in the ocean, et cetera. For humans, many plants in particular, but also some organisms, invertebrates, have medicinal properties. So many of our medicines come from plants. And as plants drop out, go extinct, et cetera, we lose the opportunities for those new medicines. And of course, there's raw materials for building, et cetera. So that's provisioning. Then we come to regulating, okay? Regulating the ecosystem, which again is the combination of all the organisms and the physical world. The ecosystem is in charge of water regulation, controlling the flow of water. And so when we have floods, big floods, as we've been having more recently, it's not because it's raining all that much more. It is raining a little more, but it's not raining all that much more. But the ecosystem is not doing a very good job of controlling the flow of water. A lot of it is staying on the surface and running off. Climate regulation, of course, temperature, rainfall, et cetera. That's all the climate. Clean air and water, plants and microbes and soil all clean the air and the water. And we need to have those things working well, or we don't have clean air and water. And of course, there's pollination. Now, I just want to bring this up. These ecosystem services are playing in the background all the time, every day, whether we're at the office, whether we're inside, outside, whatever, they're moving along. And we are starting to see a big failure of these regulating services. Everyone who's interested in native plants, of course, knows that pollinators are in trouble. But all you have to do is essentially read the paper, listen to the news, and these other regulating services are also in trouble. I happen to subscribe to the Georgetown University Climate Center newsletter. And in the newsletter today, they reported not only is there record heat in Portland, those poor people out there are suffering in 115-degree weather, which is the 3 hottest days ever have been the last 3 days. But and this is just one newsletter, there were floods in the middle of the country in, I believe, Mississippi, which caused a huge amount of damage. And there are fires already and drought in California. So these regulating services are not working right anymore. And that is a function of climate change, without a doubt. There's really no controversy about that. Ecosystem services also provide people with cultural benefits. And I think this has really come out during the pandemic, when people have recognized that everybody's felt so terrible, not physically necessarily, but out of sorts and, all messed up. Going out for a walk, for a hike, sitting in your yard or sitting somewhere quietly outside has really helped people. And so the ecosystem provides, beauty, various spirituality, recreation, of course, and education. These are important cultural services. So humans may feel, they may think, I don't care about this. I don't go outside. Even humans cannot fight the laws of nature forever. And it's, sort of coming around now that we have engaged in very unsustainable behavior on many fronts. And these services are not working as well as they used to. Biodiversity keeps the ecosystem services, but we are now losing species and genetic diversity, and the abundance of many species is also declining. So we're kind of in, we got a big problem here. Okay, so let's talk about plants. I want to talk about the decline in abundance and also in species of plants. This is a picture from a report from last year from the Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew in the UK, the state of the world's plants and fungi. I'm not going to talk about fungi, but they report that when they consider the extinction risk for plants, 2 in 5 named plants. These are plants that we already have described and they have a name. They're known by scientists. 2 in 5, 40% of those plants are estimated to be threatened with extinction. And then there are the probably hundreds of thousands of plants that we don't know anything about yet, and they're just as threatened. So this picture is actually very telling in itself. This is a tropical forest. And over here is part of the forest that looks like it's been burned. It's been cleared probably for either agriculture or palm plantation. So Indonesia is the palms, and they burn the rainforest, clear it off, drive all over the place. So they compact the soil. So the soil is basically unrecognizable as rainforest soil, and everything is really altered and in a one-way direction. Okay, so what is causing all this extinction except, in addition to cutting the rainforest down? It turns out that agriculture and aquaculture are the 2 biggest issues. Okay, terrestrial agriculture is probably the biggest. Biological resource use just means we use the plants and can drive them extinct. Natural system modifications are basically things that happen to the system just as an inadvertent result of other things we're doing. Residential and commercial development and invasive species and diseases. So, the top 5 things are all human impacts that we know about. Another thing, and actually part of the agriculture story, is that we have narrowed considerably the range of plant species that we eat. When you consider the typical European diet, think about vegetables. We eat about 10 different vegetables commonly. Around the world, there are over 7,000 edible plant species, but only 417 are considered to be food crops. And again, Europeans eat even less than that. So much less than that. So what we've done over human history is to take a very diverse array of possible foods and bring that down to a really tiny number. And when the first farmers began to domesticate plants about 10,000 years ago, maybe a little bit more, 13,000 in some cases, this is just a cartoon showing, carrots or turnips or whatever these are, some little cartoon root vegetable. It just shows a lot of genetic diversity. out there in the wild. And the initial plant domesticators, of course, they didn't know anything about plant breeding, genetics, or whatever 10,000 years ago, but they chose plants that had attributes that they liked, large seeds, or they were healthy or something. And they kept breeding those together in a sort of unconscious plant breeding, and they produced what's called land races. And in the process, they reduced the amount of genetic variability in those races so that there were different races that were locally adapted to different places, but each race was less variable than the initial thing. Then actual plant breeders got into the act in sort of the middle of the 1900s, and started to make cultivars of these land races. So different varieties of tomato, corn, et cetera. And they did regular plant breeding and artificial selection, and that reduced the genetic variability even more. And then they keep doing that, improving the cultivars, making them resistant to disease, making tomatoes that last and don't rot in the truck when they're coming across the country. And now you can even do GMO stuff, which is just essentially accelerated plant breeding by using genes from other species. So we have more diverse crops. They're in many ways more resilient, but the genetic variability has been ratcheted down. Another thing that happens is the plant breeders figured out that they could produce very vigorous plants if they took two inbred parents, which had different properties, and bred them together and sold the F1 or hybrid seed. So many, many crop plants are F1s. In fact, I was looking through my vegetable seed catalog, because I was wondering, well, what seeds could I grow if, everything goes to heck and we don't have seed catalogs anymore? Well, we can't grow F1 plants, and almost all of the advanced vegetable varieties are F1s. Very few are open pollinated anymore. So farmers and gardeners can't save seeds of F1 crops. Now, cultivars of native plants that are sold in garden centers or wherever also have reduced genetic diversity. And this graphic here, and here's the link for that. I believe I'll be sharing the slides with you. I forgot to ask about that before I started. But anyway, here are three native plants: Columbines, Black-eyed Susan, and asters. And here's some cultivars. And usually cultivars are made when plant breeders say, well, here's a interesting attribute I would like to expand on in a variety. And so maybe they choose a different color or a slightly different shape of the flower or something. And that's true for all of these cultivars. So they're very beautiful. They're generally less genetically variable than the original wild population of plants. And also they're often less attractive to pollinators. And so this experiment shows that very clearly. Here's the wild type and this is just number of pollinator visits per minute. Okay. So here's the wild type plant. That's what this is. We only have the pictures of three. We don't have the picture of this one. So the Columbine wild type gets a lot of visitors, and then these different cultivars, fewer visitors. This one gets the least. It turns out that changing the color of the flower or the leaf usually results in a declining number of visitors. Black-eyed Susans, again, the cultivars get fewer visitors. Same thing with the asters, and there's two different cultivars of asters here. So the idea here is that the breeders have bred these things to look nice in your yard, but they're not always as attractive to pollinators as the wild type. And so you have to be careful. Of course, you all know this. You have to be careful when you go to a Home Depot or whatnot, because generally the big box places often sell cultivars. And the other thing about the cultivars is that generally the genetic diversity within the cultivar is fairly low. And I'm sure all of you have seen little stickers that say propagation unauthorized. A company sells a cultivar and they don't want you to be propagating it. This keeps the genetic diversity controlled, but really that means low, and also forces you to buy from them. But the bottom line here is that cultivars are not zero for pollinators, but they're not as good as the genetically diverse wild populations, or populations bred in captivity that are bred in a way or maintained in a way that keeps them genetically diverse. So you want ideally to buy seeds and plants from nurseries who propagate their wild stock in a way that keeps it genetically variable. Okay, now let's talk about insects. Insects are in pretty bad shape. There's been a gigantic decline in the number of insect species to the extent that we can know that. There are many, many insects that are not described, and it's very hard to tell a lot of insect species apart. So when people keep track of how insects are doing, they usually go to a place and collect insects and then weigh them. They just measure how many grams they collect. Okay, that's a proxy for sort of how many insects are around and how diverse they are. And there's two studies shown here from Germany. One compared sort of 2 points, 1989 and 2013, and they trapped insects at this nature reserve in Germany and compared across the seasons these 2 years. And basically the abundance of insects, the biomass of insects they caught, declined by nearly 80% in 24 years. This is a different study also done in Germany, but in this case, insects were collected each year for 27 years at 63 different nature preserves. And they also collected various data on land use, et cetera. And there was a lot of citizen science involved in this. This was not all done by scientists, but regular people were out there at these nature centers helping with this, which is kind of interesting. But you can clearly see, and this is 1 point for each year rather than every season, a decline. And it's about the same as what these folks measured, 75% over the last 27 years, or 82% if you look in midsummer, because there's more insects in midsummer. So insects are not doing very well. And you knew that because you are interested in pollinators, and pollinators are not doing very well. Now, not all pollinators are insects, but most of them are. Okay, now I wanted to include this because I thought this was so entertaining. I read this article in the British paper, The Guardian, not too long ago, although the original paper was in 2020. But there's a crowd in the UK that has been keeping track of how many insects go splat on your windshield, okay, get intercepted by your vehicle. When I saw this, I remembered when I was a kid, a long time ago. I was a kid in the 1950s, and we would drive around, and my dad would have to stop and clean all the squished insects off the windshield all the time. And I realized when I read this article that I had not been seeing that many squished insects on the windshield anymore, which is what everybody's been seeing, same trend. What they found between about 1997, looks like, I guess at 2018, the solid line is just the trend line. And they've seen a steady decline in the number of insects. So I was very intrigued by this article because they described a new citizen science project that they're doing. They're handing out these covers for British license plates. And if you happen to be lucky enough to live in Britain, you can get one of these, put it on your front license plate, drive around, and then take it off and send it to the mothership and have somebody count them. I don't think the people I don't know if somebody counts them or you count them, whatever, but they are able then to see how many insects your car has intercepted and continue this now in many places across the UK. I was just so disappointed that I couldn't participate in this because they're not doing it in the US. Now, why are insects declining in abundance in this precipitous way? It's not too different from the factors that are affecting plant abundance and plant species diversity. Intensive agriculture, that accounts as the biggest wedge. Here are all the things that affect insect diversity. Pesticides, well, that's part of intensive agriculture as far as I can tell, although also we use many pesticides on our lawns. In fact, per acre, 10 times as many chemicals on our lawns as farmers use. Ecological traits is the next one. That means some insects have traits like they're specialized, or they don't compete well with introduced species, or they get introduced pathogens that affect them, and that causes them to decline. Urbanization, that's our lawns. Fertilizers, goes with urbanization and agriculture, and deforestation. Those are the top 6 and accounts for over 75% of the loss of insects. The same human impacts we see affecting plants. And just to beat this dead horse a little bit more, it's all of these things are a set of failures of sustainability. Our agriculture is not sustainable. We are using chemicals that are polluting the water and the air, et cetera. We're cutting down forests. This is not sustainable behavior, and it's having an impact on the natural world. Of course, when you have fewer insects, Part of that is the result of fewer native plants. In some cases, fewer insects means fewer native plants. But when you have fewer insects, you also have fewer birds. And this is a study again, from the UK. The barn swallow is found in North America, but house martin and sand martin, these two cool things, are not. And what these graphs show, this is splats on the windshield or insect abundance. As insect abundance increases, the number of breeding pairs of sand martins increase. You can't breed successfully if there's not enough insects. Same thing with barn swallows, same thing with house martins. The number of breeding pairs increases when there are more insects. Pretty clear. You need to have the insects in order to have breeding pairs of insectivorous birds. Okay, now I want to go into a few more examples of direct human impacts, like the ones we've just been talking about. And I wanted to use this, what I think is a fantastic figure that was just came out this year, a few months ago, in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. And this graphic basically is meant to describe that there's no one thing that's causing insect declines. This paper is about insects, but it applies to plants just as well. And so they call this death by 1,000 cuts, the global threats to insects. And so I'm going to talk first about the sort of direct impacts that humans are having of the types that we just discussed. And those are listed here on the bottom. But the four big ones I'll talk about, I grouped a few of these. Deforestation, okay, so here's deforestation. Agricultural intensification also incorporates insecticides and, to a certain extent, more fertilizer use, although that's in urbanization as well. Introduced species and range expansion, and urbanization and pollution. So I'll give you some examples of how these sort of human impacts are affecting native plants and insects, and then we'll talk about climate change after that. So deforestation. This is a really sad story in the tropics, where deforestation is occurring in these tropical rainforests to pave the way for industrial agriculture. And there's really two motifs here. The first one is in Indonesia. Of course, a nation of many islands. They have a tremendous tropical rainforest, which looks like this when it's when it's living. But they have cut down a lot of this tropical rainforest because Indonesia is also a great land to grow palm trees for palm oil. And palm oil, as you probably know, is in everything. And so there's a lot of money to be made by growing palm trees. Indonesia has basically cut down its rainforest to engage in this agricultural activity. In the Amazon, Brazil, other species, the rainforest is being cut down for soybean production, and that's what's going on here. This is, to me, one of the most terrifying pictures ever. I mean, look at this. There's just, I don't know, maybe 30 of these gigantic machines. So this is a big area. It couldn't look less like a tropical rainforest, okay? This used to be very, very diverse, but when you cut down the trees and you till the soil and you grow soybeans, you pretty much have taken biodiversity and put it to zero. So let's just talk about what this means for species loss. In North America, we have 17,000 plant species. That seems like a lot, 91,000 insect species. It seems like a lot until you realize that 170,000 of the 250,000 named plant species, and I think that by that they mean flowering plants, live in rainforests, okay? 17,000, that's only 1/10 of this, right? Many, many more species remain undiscovered because there's a lot of places in deep forest where people don't go, and except for indigenous people. Many of these have medicinal properties, which of course the indigenous people have been using forever. There are 25,000 named plant species in Indonesia. It's a very small space. Of these, 40% live nowhere else. So when they cut down this rainforest to make a palm plantation, they're cutting down tree species and other plant species that don't live anywhere else. That means they're gone forever. So the soil after this clearing, both places, highly degraded. And you can imagine in this situation where they've tilled, they've cut everything off, it's really dry, the water, the soil's not soaking water up anymore. The tropical forest can never regrow in this setting. Maybe it could here, but not here. It's very difficult to find solutions to this because the countries that own or have this resource within their boundaries feel that it is their right to use it to raise their economy. And we aren't buying their soybeans, but Europe is buying their soybeans and we are buying the palm oil. That's driving this. So there are various possibilities for paying countries to leave their rainforest intact, but so far those have not really caught on. So this is a big problem. Industrial agriculture in the US. Well, this is probably someplace in the center of the country. 41% of US land is in agriculture. And again, it's an extractive approach. Monocultures are the most efficient way to grow food like this because you can just horizon to horizon, you can have corn or soybeans and take big, gigantic equipment and plant it and take care of it and harvest it. Very efficient, but not sustainable. Okay, so corn, soybeans, and cotton are our biggest commodity crops. Because of this treatment, the soil is dramatically depleted relative to, like, if this was former prairie, it's not like that anymore at all. A tremendous amount of the rich soil from the prairie has gone down the Mississippi from erosion, and that leaves this really degraded. So there's a big dependence on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, et cetera. Most US farms, and this is very true for Maryland, are small and only marginally profitable. Farmers go out of business all the time. They really don't make that much money, most of them. But a few farms are huge. Sorry, this got cut off a little bit, but this graphic shows that the largest 4% of farms produce 66% of all the sales. So gigantic farms like this are really driving the agriculture economy. And it's pretty amazing. They get most of the government help too. They received most of the COVID assistance. They received most of the farm subsidies. The small farms don't get very much of that. Farms owned by marginalized communities, Blacks and Hispanics, they hardly get anything. So there's been a tremendous loss of small farms while these big farms just keep growing. 4 corporations control most of the seeds and chemicals used in U.S. agriculture. BASF, Bayer, Monsanto. It used to be 2 companies, but then they merged. Dow Chemical, DuPont. I don't know what they call themselves. These guys call themselves Bayer, but the Dow Chemical merged with DuPont not too long ago, and then there's Syngenta. So just a few companies control the seeds and the chemicals, okay? And increasingly, they're controlling the digital platforms for things like precision fertilizer, et cetera. So they've got a lock on U.S. agriculture. That means that they are a very powerful lobbying bloc, and their interest is in maintaining this system, okay, because this is how they make their money. Corporations, the U.S. Farm Bureau, and various commodity groups are really entrenched, and they want things to stay just like this. That's kind of a problem for the rest of us. How does intensive ag reduce biodiversity? Well, obviously, these huge monocultures exclude native plants. Well, when there's no native plants, there's no insects except the pests that eat the crop plants. And that's bad for the farmers. You know, if farmers had native plants around the edges, they would have what's called natural enemies that would eat the pests. But the soil, as I just explained, is highly degraded. The soil food web is really in bad shape. And the soil is not doing its ecosystem services. It's not allowing rain to infiltrate. Rain is running off. It's not holding water for soil for plants to use in dry conditions. So the very degraded soil is increasing the impacts of drought and flooding, which of course we're having now all the time. Terrestrial insects are killed by agricultural chemicals, neonicotinoids. Glyphosate use has just skyrocketed since Monsanto began selling what they call Roundup Ready cotton, corn, soybeans, alfalfa. I think there's some more. Those are plants which you can plant, and then if weeds grow, you can just spray Roundup on top of them, and it doesn't kill the crop, but it does kill the weeds. And that is so convenient for farmers. There's an awful lot of pesticide runoff, which is hurting everybody, including humans. It's going straight down the Mississippi, right along with the glyphosate and right along with all the soil from the Midwest. Tons of soil going down the Mississippi. So this is just, a totally not sustainable situation. Okay. yield in US agriculture has increased every year because we have the best, the most awesome plant breeding and the most awesome technology. But what that yield increase is disguising is that we are wrecking the soil and we are wrecking biodiversity. And as I said, even humans can't fight the laws of nature. It's going to come back and bite us sooner rather than later. Okay, solutions to intensive and industrial agriculture. Well, first of all, help small farmers be successful, because generally small farms are diverse farms, and increase equity so that some people are not getting all the money at the expense of other people. One way that this can be done, you can make it more agriculture more sustainable, is to promote more diverse agriculture. So here's a picture from this paper published in Science a couple of years ago of a commercial strawberry farm in California, monoculture, right? Over here, maybe there's something else, but it's strawberries for miles in California. Here's a more diversified alternative where you've got a small strawberry field, but there's some forests, and over here maybe they're growing something else, but there's a lot more different kinds of plants in this setting. Okay, and these authors recommend that not only are diversified farms good, that is where you're growing several different kinds of things, but if in the neighborhood there's also maybe some forest along a stream or river and some rangelands and some farms growing other things, or maybe there's something else there. Each one of those different sorts of situations has different plants, and it just increases the overall diversity in the neighborhood. You know right off the bat by looking at this that this is not as efficient as that monoculture. It's not as efficient to grow strawberries like this as it is to grow strawberries like this. That's kind of the price we have to pay. We are very used to inexpensive food in the US compared to everywhere else, especially meat, inexpensive food, because we have this industrialized food production. And when we become more sustainable in our agriculture, it's not going to be as efficient, and it's very likely that food will cost more. So we have to make these changes in ways that don't cause too much suffering in people of low income, because of course they're the ones that are going to suffer first as the food prices go up. You can see right immediately that making this happen is going to be very difficult, but we don't really have a whole lot of options because we're running out of natural resource in our farmland. Okay, solutions. I already told you one. Another solution, and this is one thing I've been working on for a few years, is to increase the use of agricultural practices that build healthy soil, because they also do a lot of other great things. They boost microbial, plant, and insect biodiversity. They improve water quality. They reduce flooding. They sequester carbon. All good things, right? What are these, miracle practices? Well, one would be to reduce synthetic fertilizer and use organic amendments instead, which means like compost or manure, et cetera. There's problems there, but put that aside for the moment. Plant cover crops. A cover crop is a crop that's planted, say, over winter in Maryland after corn or soybeans are harvested. Not in Maryland, but this person on the tractor is terminating a rye, which is a grass cover crop that grew over the winter, and he's smashing it down with this thing called a roller crimper. And right behind the tractor, he's planting soybeans into that smashed down grass. And in 3 weeks, it looks like this. The smashed down grass has died. The soybeans are coming up, and the cover crop now that's dead has a big, thick layer of biomass that is preventing the germination of weeds. So this guy doesn't have to go and spray herbicide to keep the weeds down, or as much herbicide. He might still have to spray some, but the cover crop is doing that for him. It's keeping the ground cool. It's improving soil health by adding organic material. It's holding more water. Good, all good things. And so this is a little cartoon of a bunch of different practices, planting grass along the borders of fields and the borders of waterways to intercept chemicals and neutralize them before they get to the water. Grass waterways are strips of perennial grass that are planted in ways that channel water down the grass where it soaks in. A lot of it soaks in, or it just is pervade to the river or creek, instead of forming an erosion gully. So we know how to do this amazingly The Senate just passed an agriculture bill that is going to subsidize and increase the use of some of these practices, which is really great. Now, we're getting off of agriculture, and we're going to talk about the third human impact, introduced species and range expansions. In the East, the big range expansion story is the hemlock woolly adelgid. If any of you have been up in the mountains of Maryland or Virginia, North Carolina, where there's hemlocks, this is Shenandoah National Forest before the hemlock woolly adelgid came in. And here it is after, with all the hemlocks dead. This is a little insect that is sort of like an aphid. It has sucking mouth parts, and so they gang up on the leaf veins and suck out the xylem and phloem. They disguise themselves with this waxy material, which makes people call them woolly. They're not woolly. Only mammals have hair, right? You know that. And so the hemlock woolly adelgid was introduced in Northern Virginia in 1951. And these colored lines describe how the range has expanded. This shaded area is the range of the hemlock. So where's the hemlock woolly adelgid going? Everywhere there's hemlock. And, before too long, this has been how many years? 70. The hemlocks are going to all be gone, which will be a tragedy. In the West, the introduced species of note are various forms of pine beetle. The mountain pine beetle in red here started in Colorado and then moved northwards as it got warmer. Mountain pine beetles and the other pine beetles are tiny. Okay, here's a little pencil. Here's a pine beetle. Tiny, just like the adelgid, tiny, tiny. But there are a lot of them. And not only that, the mountain pine beetle, at least, if a female finds a tree, they really like stress trees, which are a little bit easier for them to infest. The female finds a good tree, she emits a pheromone, which basically says, come on over here, this is awesome. And then, pine beetles come from everywhere and gang up on this tree. They lay their eggs, and those hatch into larvae, little maggots that churn around and chew up the wood right underneath the bark, which kills the tree. This is what forest pretty much killed by mountain pine beetle looks like. The trees have gone all sort of reddish. The mountain pine beetle became a huge problem because it was able to move north as the winters warmed, and allowed range expansion. But it gets even worse than this, because the pine beetle went up into British Columbia, and then it was warm enough that they could survive the winters in the Rockies, and they jumped over there. Then they changed onto a different pine tree, jack pine. And now this is the range of jack pine. And now they are migrating east, where they're going to get to Quebec or someplace like that. And they're going to meet up with the southern pine beetle, which is moving north. Okay. Already causing trouble in Maryland. Here's Maryland moving up farther. And then it will also switch onto jack pine. Big problem. Decimates the conifer forest. In invasive plants, so that's invasive insects. Invasive plants are invading our forests. This map from the Forest Service shows they divided the area up into little sampling subplots, and they didn't count the invasive species. They just said, is there invasive species here? Yes, no. And the color indicates the percent of subplots that had invasive species. So you can see the Appalachians filled with invasive species. Some 50 to 100% of the plots have invasive species. A little bit up here also in Western Pennsylvania, New York, West Virginia, Ohio, et cetera. And that is really changing the forest, because we get stuff like Oriental bittersweet, which you all know about. Vine just smothers everything that is it for the native vegetation and kills the trees. Urbanization, critical loss of habitat. 50% plus or minus of US land is residential, municipal, commercial, or paved, right? And so roads. Mostly it's monoculture of grass, introduced turf grass, or it's paved. Neither of these habitats is conducive for any kind of biodiversity. Many of you, of course, will be familiar with Doug Tallamy, everyone's favorite entomologist. This is one of the studies that he did that showed that his mean abundance of either caterpillars down here or spiders, which are prey for the Carolina chickadee. He and his squad of helpers, who I'm confident did not descend on the backyards together like this, but they studied a large number of suburban backyards, tallied up the prey items, and looked for chickadee nests. And they found that as the percentage of non-native plants in the backyards increased, the insect abundance decreased. And as the abundance decreased, I don't think I'm going to show you this graph, but as the abundance decreased, the chance that a chickadee nest would be found. No native plants, no insects, no chickadees. Solutions. In the same issue of Proceedings in the National Academy as that cartoon I showed you earlier, there's a great article called 8 Simple Actions to Increase Biodiversity in Your Yard. And I'm going to take you through these 8 actions. 1, convert your lawns into diverse natural habitats. And here's a cartoon that I've been using for quite some time that shows that you don't have to do this all at once because it's a really daunting prospect. Here's a sort of typical suburban house in Maryland, anywhere in a neighborhood where there's other suburban houses, and it's mostly grass. The backyards are contiguous. You can plant some more trees around the border of your property. Then you can make a bed that you expand a little bit, and you expand the beds around your house from this little strip to bigger, so that you maintain a little bit of lawn for your kids to play on, for you to play football or whatever. Doug Tallamy says the goal would be to reduce that lawn by 50%. This house has definitely done that. And then if you happen to live in a neighborhood where you can get your neighbors to do the same thing, then you have all this habitat. It's contiguous and wildlife can rove around, and there's plenty of native plants for the insects to eat, and plenty of birds, et cetera. So this is a process that, this is the way we want to see things go. You don't have to have a lot of space to plant native plants. You can, plant them in a little strip in the front yard of a condo, et cetera. So the first one is convert lawns into diverse natural habitat. The second one is grow native plants. Even a small area helps. Be careful about the cultivars, as I said before. It's not that hard to grow native plants from seed. And by verified seed, I mean from a seed company that has not just gone out in nature and collected seeds, but has gotten them from a nursery that propagates them in a sustainable way. Make friends with your neighbors and say, hey, let's do this together. Number 3, reduce pesticide and herbicide use. Obviously, if you got bare ground around flowers and shrubs, try mulch or ground covers. Here are 2 beautiful native ground covers, Allegheny spurge, Pachyra aureus. It has a different name, Senecio now, but I'm sorry, I forgot the common name. Golden ground, somebody knows. Anyway, I forget. I'm sorry. These 2 are evergreen, and this is an awesomely sort of aggressive plant, which is great if you want to fill up a lot of space and you have defined edge so you can keep it in there. But in the spring, it has these incredibly beautiful flowers, and it makes a very dense mat, so weeds do not grow there. If you want to kill something, don't use Roundup. We can't use that in Howard County anymore anyway. You can use vinegar. Household vinegar is 5% acetic acid, but you can buy up to 45%, which is really strong. And that is a contact herbicide. It doesn't go to the roots like Roundup does. If you use a stronger than 5%, you need to, wear safety glasses, gloves, protective clothing. I wear a respirator like I would wear if I was spraying a pesticide, because you don't want to breathe acetic acid, right? It's not good for your lungs. Now, this one I knew it was good to limit the use of exterior lighting, but I did not know until I read this paper that amber light is the least attractive to insects. You know how insects are like compelled to go to the light. If you have a porch light and it's white, you just have a glob of dead insects around your porch light all the time. Yellow lights are better, but amber, which is a little bit more orange, is even better. I think it's maybe only 15% as attractive as a white light. You can get these in LEDs and just screw them into your porch light. And then right there, you have done a good thing for insects. We all hate mosquitoes, but avoid bug zappers and mosquito foggers because they kill all insects, not just the ones you don't want. Try to be really careful if you wash your car to, not use much soap because you don't want to wash that down into the groundwater, into the surface water. You don't want to use driveway sealants and de-icing salts because same thing, the chemicals go down into the water. Here's 20% vinegar. Vinegar does a number on freshly germinated weeds in your garden. And if or anywhere in a flower bed. You have to be very careful, though, because if you happen to hit a plant you want with vinegar, it's like Roundup, it's gone. 6, 7, and 8. It's really important to help people understand that most insects are good. Most insects will not bite you, sting you, make you sick, or fly up your nose. they're mostly out there doing their thing and they don't care about you. The ones that get all the bad press, of course, are the ones that make us sick and are obnoxious. So it's really useful when you talk to people to help them understand that insects are useful, that we need them for all the things they do, not just pollination, but a lot of other stuff. Same thing with native plants. There's a lot of education that has to be done out there so that your average suburbanite will understand that native plants are super desirable and will not make your yard look like a vacant lot. Okay. A lot of people think that. And of course, that's not correct. Counter negative perceptions of insects and plants when you can. Become an educator and advocate. Advocate is the verb, advocate is the noun. Become an advocate for insect and plant conservation. Get involved. I mean, that's basically the key. Get involved in local politics. Support science by all means, because science is how we know what is going to work. And vote for people in the government who will support your views, okay? And not be out there denying science and going off the deep end. And I added this one, if you're familiar with Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Last Hope. He talks about turning everybody's yard into a nationwide distributed homegrown national park, which I think is a wonderful idea. So you can do that with your own yard. You can maybe get your town to put a native plant garden in the cul-de-sac out front of your house. That would be great. And these little indentations in the curb are where water can run down in there from the street. So it helps control stormwater. Okay, climate change. I don't have much time, but I'll tell you a few things about climate change. Climate change is caused by lack of human sustainability. Okay, we've burned all this fossil fuel, we've changed the atmosphere, and it is changing the climate. Up above here, that I didn't show you before, are all the climate change things. Climate change intensifies droughts, it produces changes in the season, intensifies storms, causes fires. It doesn't cause fire, but intensifies fires. And disrupts the interactions between species, between plants and pollinators, et cetera. So I'll give you a few examples of that in the next couple of minutes. All of you gardeners know that the seasons are changing. Winters are becoming warmer. The hardiness zones are moving northward. So the hardiness zone tells you what plants can live there over winter. It's a measure of the coldest day each year in the previous 15 years. And you can see the warmer colors are warmer and they are moving northwards. If you just look at Maryland, you can see in 1990, we had some of the green, that's zone 6. Now, no green in Maryland. And now we have some of zone 8, even up here in the Eastern Shore. As it gets warmer and the hardiness zones move up, that is indicating that the southern edge of the range, if some organism lives here in Northern Virginia, say, the southern end of the range is becoming warmer. That causes loss of suitable habitat and can cause local extinction. This is having an impact on forests. The composition of the forest now looks like this. This is a little key to what these colors mean. In our area, we're in the dark green, and that is oak hickory forest. The sort of olive green is maple, beech, and birch to the north of us. Up here in Maine, there's spruce and fir. If we allow climate change to proceed in the way it's going now until 2100, as we don't do anything, things are going to change dramatically. Just look at the Northeast and how that's different. The oak hickory forest is moving northwards. There's a little bit of maple, beech, and birch left, not much. The spruce and fir has moved up here into Canada. Things have dramatically changed. There's an expansion of the oak and pine forest. So it's really different. That is a reflection of the change in the suitability of habitats. A tree species in the forest, say here on the border, a little bit away from the border of West Virginia and the oak and hickory forest, this area is becoming unsuitable for oak and hickory forest, and it's going to convert to oak and pine forest, okay? That's because it's getting warmer. Okay, I'll just tell you without explaining this graph because I'm running out of time, that a former colleague, David Inouye, who used to be a professor at University of Maryland, spent years every summer going to the Rocky Mountains and measuring when native flowers began and ended their blooming period. There's a whole list of them right here. And he mapped that onto this graph where this pink line is where they started, okay? And after 39 years, most of them have started to bloom earlier. So they've moved to the left of the line. Most species are flowering earlier. That's the take-home message from this graph. That can be a big problem because when the plants flower earlier, like this delphinium, often after they start to flower, there's a cold snap, a snow, and the flowers can freeze and then be destroyed. Then there's no nectar or less pollen, less or no pollen or nectar for pollinators. That's bad for the pollinators, obviously. And it's bad for the plants because they're not setting seed that year. Here's a bunch of sad frozen flowers after a freeze. One thing that has not been studied that much, but which I think is going to be a profound problem, is that every species responds to the changes in season independently. Okay. Now, plants and pollinators are matched up in timing. That is, when the plants flower, the pollinators are there. They're matched up because they've evolved over thousands of years to match. But each one of those responds to the change in seasons independently. So in many cases, the plants are flowering earlier, but the insects aren't coming out of their winter diapause earlier. So the plant flowers, there's no insects. That's happened for all these three species. David Inouye showed that. Here's that delphinium, again, beautiful big hawk moth that pollinates it. Here's another species. Here's a hummingbird pollinated plant. These species have all gotten out of whack with their pollinator. When the pollinator is not there, when the flowers are there, then you don't get pollinated, you don't get seeds. Then the pollinators show up, there's no flowers, then you don't have any insects. So bad for everybody. This is an obvious set of impacts: heat, drought, and fire. All of those are increasing because of climate change. Heat stress reduces plant growth rate because, well, the leaves can dry up and obviously you don't have photosynthesis. But when it's hot and dry, photosynthesis stops because plants lose moisture during photosynthesis. So they just close down photosynthesis. So it also creates general plant stress. And then you can get invasion by pathogens, like this tree was invaded by armillaria root rot, and it looked great, but fell over because the whole inside was rotten. Increasing summer heat means more drought, even though you have the same rainfall. Okay. And these are plants killed by drought. I'm going to skip this and just tell you what happened. Large trees suffer more in drought. I'll tell you, these are different instances of drought. Each line is a different drought. They measured the diameter of the trees and how they were affected by that individual drought in the color. And this is the drought response. So their growth in drought versus before. And so below this line means they do worse in the drought. And so what you see when the lines go down like this for a given drought, larger plants suffer more, okay? That the lines going down in parallel for all these different droughts shows you larger plants suffer more. The lines going up shows you larger plants die more. This is plant diameter. This is mortality rate. Larger plants die more. And larger plants especially die more when they are infested by pine beetles, okay? So these solid symbols are cases of drought where the plants have been infested by pine beetles. And you can see I cut this off down here. This is size. Larger plants, more mortality. And all the solid symbols show more mortality and a stronger relationship with size than do the open symbols, no pine beetles. So having pine beetles makes it much more likely that the plants are going to die and much more likely that the big plants are going to die. That's really a tragedy because the large plants help the ecosystem more than the small plants. They store more carbon, they do all kinds of good stuff. So that is a problem. Wildfires, California wildfires last year, aggravated by years of drought. 4 million acres were burned. One fire, I read this today, killed 10 to 14% of the world's giant sequoias. An incredibly iconic tree, hundreds of years old. 10 to 14% killed by one fire in California. And 2021 is shaping up to be even worse. Fire season is now 2.5 months longer than in 1970 already. So here we are. I've gone through this litany of human impacts and how this has affected native plants. What are we going to do about this? We got to do something. The first thing I think we need to do is, as a species, I don't mean you, I mean, as a species, we need to change our attitude about our place in nature. I think the Western cultural tradition basically encourages this. Okay. Humans are the top of the heap and meant to control or use all other species, or in the best case, be their steward. Okay. But it puts humans a little outside of nature. What we really need to do is recognize we are not outside of nature. We are inside of nature. If we hurt nature, we are hurting ourselves. And we need to really get with that and get that into our heads, because a lot of people don't care whether, orangutans go extinct or polar bears go extinct, but they would care if humans went extinct, obviously. So we are not separated from nature. We are part of it. And there are ways that we can bend the curve, flatten the curve, as they said, for COVID on biodiversity loss. And here they are. Consume less. That means buy less stuff and eat less. Produce things sustainably. Reduce other drivers like land use change. Slow climate change, which is a huge prospect, but we have to do it. Conserve and restore natural sites like nature preserves, etc. I could go into more detail, but I'm completely out of time. So I'll just end by saying nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something about one of those problems. And the good news and bad news is there's so much work to do, so many things we need to solve, that you can choose your passion. What is it you're interested in? Find something you're interested in that will help solve one of those problems and work on that. Everybody can do something. So I'll close there. I'll just say, if you found this interesting, you can go to my website at climatecorner.org and peruse the list of remaining 6 webinars I'm giving this summer in climate and sustainability. And I would welcome your registration, and I would love to see you there. So thank you.
Thank you for this wealth of information. Sara, people have asked about your upcoming report on soil health. Will it be published as a book? Where will it be available? And while we're waiting, do you have any resources to recommend to learn about soil health and improving the soil?
Yeah, just wait a couple weeks and my report will be out. It's being published by the Isaac Walton League of America and the National Wildlife Federation, and it will be free. It will be a PDF. If I remember, or one of y'all from the Native Plant Society reminds me, I will send you the PDF, and it would be great if you wanted to put that on your website, and then all your members could access it. I'll just say it is the report about soil health that I wish I would have had when I started learning about soil health. And there's a lot of cool biology going on in the soil, and we can use that to help make agriculture more sustainable. So I hope everybody reads it.
And there was another question about your slides from this webinar. Will the slides be available on your website? Now, obviously, people can see the slides when they view the recording that we're going to put up, but people are interested also in just the slides.
Yeah, I'll put the slides up on my website. I just made this website for the purpose of having some place to have people go to register for the webinars. So it's still quite under construction, but it's not hard for me to put the slides up there. And I will do that in the next couple of weeks. If anybody has got a burning need to have the slides, you can email me.
One person has asked, she understands that regenerative agriculture can sequester more carbon. Do native plants matter for sequestration?
Yeah, they do, absolutely, because native plants have deeper roots. And when you have deeper roots, you get carbon deeper in the soil, and more is stored, and it's safer. It's lost less. So yeah, native plants are really important. And one class of agricultural practices that is really great for carbon sequestration is to plant native grasses with deep roots around the edges of fields. Use them for those filter strips that intercept the sediment and chemicals. Plant trees and shrubs. So yeah, absolutely.
And there were many questions about the changes in the hardiness zones, which you did address. But one follow-up question was, what should we do about planting in Maryland, specifically whether we should plant Maryland natives, especially trees, if there are species that are not going to survive over the long term?
Well, that is absolutely a question. And I think it would not be a dumb thing to look at the native range and not plant a tree that is currently at the southern end of its range, but try to plant a tree or especially a tree because they live a long time from a more southerly location. So the whole ecotype thing is kind of being turned on its head because some population might have evolved in Maryland, but hey, Maryland's changing. So keep that in mind. A population that evolved in North Carolina might do better in Maryland in a few years.
A number of questions and comments about cultivars. Picking one, do you have any comments on the question of utilization of cultivars by insects as compared to the wild types?
Well, I showed that in the slides. Insects don't utilize the cultivars as much as they don't visit them as much as they visit the wild type. And I think I mentioned that changes the cultivars who have different like forms of the flowers, like the double cone flowers, or things that are the cultivars that are different, have a different flower color or especially a different leaf color, are not recognized by insects as much. Yes. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your attention and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.